Let's start first with your name. Your name and the name you were born with.
My name is Julia Lakritz. I was born Julia Haber. Always spelled it the same way in Polish. My nickname was Jula. In English it's Julie, so it stayed pretty much the same as it's been.
When were you born, Julie?
January 16th, 1938.
Thinking back as far as you can, what are some of your very early memories?
This is something which I don't remember personally, but I was told that I was a very early talker, and that when the Russians invaded, or when the Russians came into Poland in 1939 into our little town of Sasov, my father held me on his shoulders and I yelled, "Chai żywy towarzysz Stalin," which means "Long live Comrade Stalin." So that's as far as my very first memory is concerned. I really don't remember much of my childhood whatsoever. My very earliest memory really is when my maternal grandmother died. And I remember being so very upset that I either threw myself or hit myself on a stove and burned my arm, and somewhere I still have the scar. But I really and truly don't remember much about my childhood.
Now, how old were you when your grandmother died? Do you know?
I must have been somewhere around 2 or 3, probably around 3, because by that time the Germans had already invaded Poland. So I must have been around 3.
How did she die?
She died of pneumonia, from what I can gather. She had gone out into the woods to forage for mushrooms and other edible plants, and had caught a cold and came home and died.
So you don't remember when the Russians invaded? You don't remember what you had been told?
Just remember what I was told, right.
And
now I just want to mention that as far as our family was concerned, and I think probably as far as most Jews in Sasov were concerned, the coming of the Russians was not considered an invasion, certainly not by our family.
How were they welcomed then? What was it considered, if not an invasion?
It was considered perhaps a safety measure, that now this part of Poland would be safe from the Nazis. That's my interpretation. But I do know that the Russians were not viewed with alarm.
Where is Sasov located in Poland?
It's in southeastern Poland, in the Ukrainian border.
So the Germans came after the Russians, and that was in 41?
41. Right.
That the Germans came. Well, let's go back a little bit. Do you remember anything about Sasov before the Germans came?
Literally nothing. I remember my paternal grandmother's house very slightly. I can visualize the stove. Basically, I can visualize a room, and I really don't know how true what I'm remembering is. So basically, no, I can't remember a thing.
Do you know what the size of the Jewish population in Sasov?
I think it was around, in fact, I looked it up, I think it was around, at the time of World War II, around 2,500.
And what was the population of the town
It kind
entirely?
it probably was, the Jewish population at that time probably was 50% of the general.
It was about 5,000 people.
Yeah, yeah. It was a small rural community.
Do you know anything about the relations between the Jews and the non-Jews before the war? Did your parents tell you anything?
Well, it depended. Now, I know that my mother's family had extensive dealings with non-Jews. My mother was very comfortable and had a lot of non-Jewish friends. She went to public school. My mother's family, her father was a butcher, but her mother's family were small farmers, tradesmen, and so on, and they had extensive dealings with the Poles and the Ukrainians. My father's family, on the other hand, my father's father, my paternal grandfather, had a manufacturing plant where they manufactured atarot, the decorations for the talit, for the talisim. And from what I gather, at least his parents, had very few dealings with the non-Jews, especially his father, his mother more so. His family, he was the youngest of 9 siblings, some of whom rebelled against the strict religious upbringing, and they went on to secular gymnasiums, and they moved to larger cities. So, but my mother's family had extensive interactions with non-Jewish people, and it's probably one of the reasons that my grandmother and my mother survived the war.
So the relationships that your mother established were quite positive.
Yes. She had childhood friends who, from the little that she told me, helped her during the war, and even to escape from the labor camp.
Were there synagogues? There must have been synagogues in Sasov. Do you remember any synagogues?
There were Stieblach, little storefront synagogues. Sasov was considered quite a center of Jewish activity and Jewish learning, but I really can't remember anything. I'm not even sure I was in a synagogue ever in my life as a child.
What did your father do for a living?
He was a dentist.
And he left the family at some point to join the army?
Yes, in 1939, when the Russians came into Sasov, he was taken into the Russian army. And he spent the Second World War as a dentist in the Russian army.
Did you have any contact with him at all?
None whatsoever.
No letters or?
Not.
As far as you know.
There probably were before 1941, but
not after.
Certainly not afterwards. Not afterwards.
So you don't remember him, do you?
No, not at all.
Until after the war.
Right.
Okay, in 1941, the Germans came. Do you remember any of that at all?
Not the actual coming, the Germans. I think I remember what I was told, a little bit that I was told. The first thing that happened was my mother was the oldest of 3 siblings. She had 2 younger brothers. Her youngest brother had joined the Polish army, and he was not around when the Germans invaded. But her middle brother, the very first few days of the German invasion, was killed, not by Germans, but by Ukrainians, who killed many Jews, among them my uncle.
And what happened to the community after the Germans came, the Jewish community?
Well, there were several Aktionen by the Germans. I believe one in right away in 41 and one in 42, where the majority of the population of the Jews were deported to concentration camps, and then in 42, the rest were killed. Those who had not been deported originally were killed.
Were you living in a ghetto before the deportations?
Yes. That's my understanding of what it was. Basically, there were certain areas that were surrounded by barbed wire, and all the Jews were herded into the houses within that area, and so it was in effect a ghetto. Yes.
Where were you living then? Do you remember?
I was living with my grandmother and my grandfather, my maternal grandmother and my grandfather, and we were living in my great uncle's house along with many other families. I can't tell you how many people, but there were a large number of people living in that house. And my mother, in the meantime, had been taken to what was euphemistically called a work camp. So I was living with my grandmother and my grandfather.
Do you remember anything about this house?
The only thing I really remember about this house was that it had a huge oven where bread was baked and other things were cooked. And this oven was used as an escape route when the final solution, when the Germans took their final action in Sasov. Apparently the adults in the house had burrowed behind the bricks, had burrowed a tunnel that led into the sewers of the city, and that was we used that as an escape route when the final solution by the Germans took place, when the final action by the Germans took place.
So the adults were expecting this kind of action?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Do you know what they had been hearing? Had they heard from refugees coming into town?
Well, I think we were, I don't, my time sequences and my dates are very vague, so I really never talked about this with my mother. But I am assuming that we were part of the second group of the group that was left in Sasov. I'm assuming that we were not, well, obviously, we were not part of the original population that was deported to the Belzec concentration camp. So obviously we were left, and we obviously knew what our fate would be. Or perhaps I'm quite sure that at that point we knew, or the adults knew, what was in store.
Did you know anything? You were about 4 years old then?
No, I can't remember knowing what was going on. I can't remember that at all. I may have, but I certainly can't remember that I was aware that we were in danger of being killed. I don't think I.
Do you have memories of other children at that time? Or?
No.
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 Okay.
I don't think there were other children in the house at the time. In fact, I'm quite sure, because I am the only surviving child from Sasov. Of the children who lived in Sasov at that time. And according to my parents, I think he said something around 500. I was the only one who survived.
And you never saw any of those children either when you were living in your grandmother's house. You didn't get out of the house.
No.
Really?
No. Not that I remember. I just don't remember.
Do you remember this was your great uncle's house?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember being hungry? Do you remember where food came from?
I must have been hungry, but I can't remember.
There were, you said about 15 people in this house,
That's
approximately?
my impression, yes.
How many of these people survived the war?
As far as I know, my grandmother and I were the only ones.
You the adults dug this escape route.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about the escape then?
I have two very vivid memories about that. One, after we were in call it the sewer, it may have been the tunnel leading to the sewer, I was coughing, and one of the other people who had escaped from the house tried to put a pillow over my face, and my grandfather tore off the pillow and said if his granddaughter was going to die, then everybody was going to die. The other thing I remember quite vividly was dogs barking, walking on the street, barking and looking for any Jews that had been missed in the second action. And those two things I remember. I don't remember the escape through the oven, the hearth. I remember the hearth, but I do remember the pillow, and I remember the dogs barking.
Do you remember being scared?
I must have been, but again, I don't remember.
How long were you in the sewer?
I can't tell you. I have no idea. I just don't remember. I don't know.
And the sewer led to where? Where did you go then?
Well, from what little I remember, from what little my mother talked about it or told me, and my grandmother, we escaped through the sewer, through, I assume, a manhole. And then my grandmother, my grandfather, and I were taken in by a Polish family who had been given some money and gold coins or whatever at the beginning of the war, just in case something happened, and they took us in and they hid us in the attic of the barn, top part of the barn.
What do you remember about that? What was that like?
Again, it's amazing how much I don't remember. What I do remember is that to amuse myself, since there was straw on the floor, I would, when my grandfather was sleeping or dozing, I would take the straw and tickle his nose so he would wake up. remember that he taught me how to fold a square of paper into the shape of a bird, an origami bird, and I still can do this to this day. I remember him teaching me a nonsense rhyme, which I can still recite.
Would you recite it?
Egede megede zülige aber fabel dumade, ikke piki dumatriki, klotz urem seitz. It's nonsense, it's not Yiddish, it's just nonsense, words and syllables. And I still remember that. That is really all I remember from that time.
What language were you communicating with your grandparents?
Yiddish, I assume, although I may have been talking Polish with my grandmother, because I did know Polish, so I must have been talking, or I may have even been talking Polish to both of them.
Do you remember your Polish at all?
No, not at all.
But Yiddish you do.
Yiddish I do. Yes.
Do you know the name of this family?
No, I don't.
And they had been given money by your parents
Yes.
before the war,
Yes,
in preparation.
yes.
This was before your father left for the Russian army.
Yes,
Prison.
yes.
And you remember the straw, the hay in the barn?
Yes.
That's about all.
That's about it.
Do you remember being fed by them?
I must have, we must have. But again, I don't remember.
And you were there for, what, about a year, you think?
About a year, yes. In the meantime, my mother was in the forced labor camp, which was not too far from the town, or just outside the town. And apparently some of the Ukrainian guards, or at least one of the Ukrainian guards of the camp, had been a classmate of hers. And so he would allow her to sneak out at night and bring us some food and come and see us occasionally. But again, I don't remember her doing this. So it must have been fairly infrequent.
What happened then?
In one of the times that my mother had come to see us, the camp was destroyed and all the inmates were shot, were taken to the woods and shot. And since she wasn't there, she survived. Now, in thinking back, I doubt whether this was coincidence. She may indeed have been warned by her friend or the guard that this was going to happen, and therefore she survived because she wasn't there when it happened. And at that point, the Polish family became, of course, fearful of sheltering Jews and told us to go. And so my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, and I decided to separate so that it would be less suspicious. And I went with my mother, my grandmother went in one direction, my grandfather went in another direction, and we never heard from my grandfather, so he was obviously killed. And my grandmother was caught by a German patrol, and they were going to shoot her. Of course, this is what she told us. They were going to shoot her when the commander of the patrol said, "Why waste a bullet on this emaciated woman? She's going to die anyway. Let's just let her go." And they did, and she survived. In the meantime, my mother and I hid in the woods. And my grandmother went to see a woman by the name of Mrs. Żurawska. And this woman had been a patient of my father, or her husband, Josef Żurawska, had been a patient of my father's. And Mrs. Żurawska gave my grandmother her identity papers so that she could pass through German lines if she were stopped. And my grandmother tried to find us, came to find us, tried to find us in the woods. And according to her, she had a dream where her mother appeared to her in the dream and told her just exactly where to find us in the woods. And she did. She found us. And then we went back to Mrs. Raska's house and were hidden by her for the rest of the war.
Think back to your time in the woods. What do you remember about that?
Several things that, it being very cold, I know that I had frostbite on my ears. At one point, we came to a ravine, and my mother tried to convince me that we should both commit suicide, that we should jump into the ravine. She tried to tell me that we would go to heaven and be angels, and we would have enough food to eat. We would wear white clothing, and that we would be warm. It would not be cold anymore. And I refused. And she obviously didn't force me, so we didn't jump, and we survived. She would send me to beg for food, figuring that a child would get a more sympathetic reception. And in some places, they did indeed give us some food. In one place, they gave me flowers instead of food. In some places, I couldn't even get through because there were dogs in the yard. And in one farmhouse, they invited us to come in and have food with them. And just at that time, a German patrol happened to come by, and I just dashed into a closet. My mother pulled me out and made some comment about what a shy child I was, and obviously the Germans accepted that and ate, and we all ate, and they left, and we left, and we survived.
That was one of your closer calls in the woods then?
Yes.
Did you have identity? You didn't have identity papers, but they didn't ask to see
They
them.
didn't ask. We were just part of the farm family, eating with them. And now it was interesting that when I talked to the children at Beth Israel about this, they asked me, do you think perhaps the Germans suspected that you were Jewish and just may not have taken any action? And I said, it certainly is possible. And I think, it shows, our need to believe that there is good among such evil. And I think the children, and it may indeed have been the case. But in any case, they did not bother us.
Your mother, however, had light hair.
Yes.
Looked quite Aryan.
Yes,
didn't
my
she?
mother looked quite Aryan. She had white hair. She was blonde, blue eyes, very tiny nose. She looked very, very, quote, Polish.
And you think that may have helped her
I'm sure. Oh, I'm quite
more
sure.
than once?
I'm quite sure. I'm quite sure. Because if we had looked, obviously, Jewish, I'm quite sure the outcome would have been very different. And my grandmother, the same. She was also she looked very much like a Polish peasant.
So you were found eventually by your grandmother,
Yep.
and you were still in the woods.
Yes. And because Mrs. Zhurevska agreed to shelter us, we all went back to Mrs. Zhurevska's farmhouse, and she took us in, and which was in itself remarkable, of course. But what was really quite unbelievable is that Mrs. Zhurevska and her family had sheltered another Jewish family before us, a family of 4. And on one of the occasions when her husband, Yosef, was taking food to the previous Jewish family, he was surprised in the barn by bandits who were roaming the countryside at that time, deserters, and they killed him and the Jewish family. And so Mrs. Zhurevska and her 2 teenage daughters buried those 5 people in the field so that nobody would know that they had sheltered this family. And after that, she took us in and kept us until the end of the war.
Julie, why do you think she did that?
She once said it was just the right thing to do. She really, I don't even think she considered it anything extraordinary. She was a very religious woman. She just said it's the right thing to do. And she didn't try, it wasn't a matter of trying to proselytize or trying to convert us. She certainly, at that point, we had nothing but our rags, so there was no expectation that she would gain anything. And she put her life in danger and the life of her children in jeopardy by doing what she did. She just died this March. She was in her 90s. And she was just an extraordinary woman who considered herself quite ordinary.
You said she was known to your family
Her husband had been a patient of my father's, and that was the only connection.
So you weren't social friends. You said your mother and grandmother had a number of Gentiles who were social friends, but she was not one of them.
When I said they had interactions, I don't think they had. My mother did have school friends, but no, this was not This was not a social relationship whatsoever.
What do you remember about the barn, living in the barn?
Mrs. Jarewska was extraordinary in all ways. She would, of course, she had to bring us food. She had to wash our few rags that we have. She had to take care of our waste products. And she would do things like gathering strawberries and bring them so I could have some fresh fruit. Her little boy, she had 4 children. Her older daughter was away at a labor camp in Germany, and she had the 2 teenage daughters who were at that time 12 and 14, and she had a little boy. He was anywhere from 3, 4, or 5. I'm not exactly sure how old he was at that time. He must have been about 3 or 4. And we could hear him because he had a hen, and we could hear him sometimes come in and ask his hen why she hadn't laid the egg for him. And what had happened, Mrs. Jarewska had taken that egg and fixed it for me, so I would have some nutritious food. So that's the kind of person she was.
Tell more about living in the barn. Do you remember the winter there? Do you remember trying to stay warm?
To tell you the truth, no. I really, in looking back on this, I don't remember the day-to-day experiences whatsoever. I just remember some highlights, maybe low points. But as far as day-to-day life, I don't remember.
Did you ever meet Mrs. Jarewska's 2 teenage daughters?
No. No.
So you were alone with your mother?
And my grandmother.
And your grandmother, the 3 of you. For how long?
Probably about half a year.
What happened next?
Well, as the war was ending, the family decided to abandon the farm because there was a lot of bombardment, and Germans were retreating, the Russians were advancing, and it was too dangerous to stay. And so she decided to abandon the farm and flee somewhere else with a horde of refugees, and we, of course, left the barn and also decided to leave the area where the bombs were falling, basically. And we wandered about, and because of the bombs falling and the shooting and so on, we took shelter in some kind of excavation, some kind of bunker. It may have been a primitive bomb shelter. And the next thing I remember is that there was a tremendous amount of shouting in Russian. And we had covered the entrance of this bunker with leaves and with dirt. And there was a tremendous amount of shouting in Russian to the effect, "Come out with your hands up," and my grandmother shouting, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And we crawled out of the bunker, and the Russian soldiers were there. And of course we considered them our liberators, and they were. And they took us to the barracks and fed us. And I remember that my grandmother would not eat the pork or the bacon that they were serving. She said she just wasn't, now that she was free, she wasn't going to eat pork. We went back to Sasov, which had been completely destroyed. We our house, what had been our house, of course, was destroyed, we were able to sift through the rubble and find pictures. We did find some pictures, which we rescued. We stayed in Sasov, again, I don't know how long, not too terribly long, but we stayed long enough so that my father returned from the war and found us.
Where did you stay?
I don't know. We must have stayed in a house that was not destroyed, but it was not our original house.
And do you recall were any of the other people from Sasov, either presumably the non-Jewish population, not the Jews, but did they come back as well, or?
I assume they may, well, they probably never left. They may have left because of to protect themselves from bombing, but they were not exterminated.
But their houses were intact.
I don't know. I'm sure there were some that were intact because we lived somewhere in a house.
And what about the Jewish population?
Yes,
You mentioned you were the only child.
I was the only child. I know there were some others who did survive. I vaguely remember some people, but I can't tell you any details whatsoever.
Do you know how long it was before your father returned?
It was fairly soon, because shortly after he returned, we left Sasov and went to Lakritz, and stayed there for a year. And I started first grade in Lakritz.
Do you remember your father's return?
Yes and no. Basically, he was a stranger. So he says that I said something to the effect of tate tate. I remember his return. I remember the stranger returning. And I do remember that it was sort of a mixed feeling, because I think that I didn't have my mother to myself anymore. I had to share her with this stranger. So it was really a very mixed. I remember having mixed feelings about it.
So shortly after he returned, you moved with your family to Lakritz.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you were there for about a year?
Yes.
Tell about that year.
Well, I started first grade in Poland, in Gliwice. And there was still so much anti-Semitism in Poland, even after the conclusion of the war, that when my mother registered me for first grade, she told the teacher that I was Jewish, but the other children did not know that I was Jewish. And I remember several experiences in first grade. First of all, it was a public school, but we still went to Mass. And on one occasion, I remember being absolutely terrified because some of the children were taking communion, and I was afraid that our row would have to get up and take communion, and I had no idea what that entailed. I could see what was going on, but I didn't know if you had to say something or do something other than take the wafer. But luckily, that never happened. I also learned to pray in Polish, and if I wanted to annoy my grandmother, all I had to do was cross myself in Polish and say, w imię Ojca i Syna i Ducha Świętego. W imię Ojca i Syna i Ducha Świętego. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And
What was her reaction?
she would go right through the roof. And of course, that was the power that I had over her at that time. Another incident that I remember was that I was playing in the courtyard of the apartment house where we lived in Lakritz with some other children when the mother of one of the other children came out either on the balcony or yelled out her window, "Don't play with that Jew," meaning me. And at that point, my father put on his full Russian regalia and came out and screamed at her that if she didn't shape up, he was going to take her to prison or some such thing. And the Poles were quite terrified of the Russians at that point, who were the occupying army. So that was his revenge. But there was still a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism even after the war. And so my family decided to leave.
Were there many Jews in Lakritz at that point?
There were. I think there were. There must have been, it was a larger city, there must have been some more economic opportunities. I remember that my grandmother and my mother would go to flea markets and try and buy and sell things. And I do remember other Jewish adults, and one child who was an orphan and whose at one point my parents were considering taking her in, but then an uncle from the United States surfaced, and she was reunited with that family. So yeah, there were other Jews, but I can't give you the details.
And were the Jewish children, other Jewish children, also attending the public schools?
As far as I know, I was the only Jewish child in my class.
Did you feel safe in Lakritz?
To tell you the truth, I don't think I knew any better. I don't remember feeling unsafe. I remember one incident where I had gone sledding with some other children and didn't come home until quite late, and coming home and my parents being absolutely frantic, and I couldn't see any reason why they would be. No, I don't remember feeling unsafe. The only thing that I do remember is feeling uneasy about making mistakes in any Catholic ritual, so that people would discover that I was Jewish.
So that was a secret you had to maintain in school.
Yes. But I'm not sure that at that point I knew what Jewish meant.
Did you have Jewish ritual at home at all? At that point, it's hard to remember.
Oh, well, yes. I
Did you do Shabbos or
I can't remember. I can't remember doing it. But things were so chaotic that I'm not sure that wine was available or challah was available or whatever. But now that you mention it, no, I can't remember doing Shabbos.
But as you said, you didn't know what being Jewish
exactly. Right.
Anyway.
Right. I had no idea what it entailed, and I thought, as I said, crossing myself was a lot of fun because it got a rise out of my grandmother. So.
But you had a sense of being different
Yes.
from the other two.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
How was your family supporting itself at that point for that year?
I really don't know. I have to ask my father. Well, I think there probably was. I know that my grandmother and my mother would go to these flea markets. My grandmother was also a very good seamstress. My father had been in the Russian army, so he may have come home with some money. And I also think at that point, some of the relief organizations were contributing to the refugees.
You said that your mother and your grandmother would go to the flea markets. What did they have to trade?
I'm not sure. They may have bought things and then traded them and schmappes, rags, old clothing, whatever. There was a market for anything and everything.
Did you know at that point, the family know that your grandfather did not survive?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
How did you know?
No, he just never reappeared after the war. So we just assumed that he had been killed. And of course, we knew that my mother's middle brother had been killed by the Ukrainians. Her youngest brother, who had been in the Polish army, had been taken as a prisoner of war. And they did have, before the Nazis came in, they did have some kind of communication with them. And the last that they had heard was that from another prisoner who had escaped, that he had escaped from the prison camp. But that was the last that they had heard. So he obviously did not survive. And my father's family, he was the youngest of 9 siblings, were all exterminated, except for an older sister who had come to the United States in the 1920s. So 7 of his siblings and all his nieces and nephews were killed, except for one niece who survived in France.
And your father's family was living in Sasov?
Well, they were living in various places.
His siblings?
Some of them, actually, his oldest brother was living in Vienna. Some of them were living in Warsaw, some in Krakow. So they were not, in fact, most of them were not living in Sasov. They had gone to larger cities.
The one who, the niece, your father's niece survived. Is that right? And
Yes.
that was in France?
Yeah. Originally, my father's oldest brother, Josef, had gone to Vienna. He was a teacher in Vienna. And he married a woman from Sasov, and they had 2 children. At the beginning of when the Germans invaded Austria, he was taken very early on and killed. And then my cousin Juliet still has a document from the German authorities saying that if they want to retrieve his ashes, they would have to come and pay a fee for his ashes. And my cousin Juliet, her mother and her brother, decided to flee to Paris. And her mother, Rebecca, and she survived the war because her mother was the cook for the head of the French Red Cross, and she sheltered them. She sheltered my cousin Juliet and her mother Rebecca, but she either couldn't or wouldn't do the same for Juliet's younger brother, Leo. And he, 3 months before the war, he escaped into Switzerland and was returned by the Swiss authorities to France and killed. So actually the only family on both my mother's and my father's side that survived was my cousin Juliet and her mother.
And she stayed in Paris?
She stayed in Paris. She's still living. She's 81 years old, and she lives in Lyon now. And we found her after the war. My family wanted to leave Poland very, very desperately. They did not want to stay in Poland, and since we couldn't come to the United States because of the quota, we took a train basically and went to Paris. And in Paris, we found my cousin Juliet and her mother, who was still living at that time.
When you went to Paris, were you aware that they were
No.
alive? Or?
No, we were not. They had a registry of survivors, and we found that they were living.
So that was their last known address to you?
Right. And in Paris, my parents made the rounds of various embassies trying to find a place that would take us, and the only place that would take us was the Dominican Republic. And so that's how we wound up in the Dominican Republic.
What do you remember about being in Paris, living in Paris?
Since my parents didn't know how long we would stay in Paris, they enrolled me in a French school. And so I attended French school for probably less than a week, but I remember taking the metro to school.
By yourself?
I think it was with my mother. I'm sure it was with my mother. And we were housed in a hotel on the Avenue de Fort. The hotel was called the Hotel Métropole. And it was a very, very grand hotel with a huge, magnificent balcony overlooking a central ballroom. And there were all these striking women walking around the hotel. And of course, they were prostitutes. And I remember there was another girl from somewhere about my age. And since neither one of us could speak French, and she couldn't talk Polish, but we would communicate. One of us would go out up on the balcony, and one of us would stay down in the lobby, and we would just jabber back and forth in some language that we made up, some language of our own, but we thought we were just being very, very dramatic to do that. So we stayed in Paris for, I remember going to school in Paris, as I said, for several days.
You would have been about 8 or 9 then?
This was in 1946, so I was 8. Yes.
The hotel must have seemed quite elegant to
Oh,
you
it was magnificent. It was magnificent.
after living in barns.
Yeah, it was magnificent.
Were you being supported by relief money at that point?
I assume so. Yes.
And you knew, what do you remember about that time? You knew your parents were trying to find a place for you to go.
Yes. But I think it was a very exciting time for me. This was, I remember that in Paris, I saw my first black person in Paris. All these experiences were so brand new after war-torn Poland. Paris was relatively magnificent. I remember going to see the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe and a few sites. We didn't have much time for sightseeing.
Your father was going from embassy to embassy at that point?
Yes.
Would he come home at night very discouraged?
Yes. The only place, as I said, that would take us was the Dominican Republic that would give us papers.
Obviously, you had never heard of the Dominican Republic before. Had your parents?
No. They knew nothing about that part of the country.
We were talking about Paris, living in Paris, and the fact that none of you had ever heard of the Dominican Republic before. Did your parents know what language they spoke there or anything?
As far as I know, I don't think they knew anything about it. They absolutely had no idea. I think Central America for pre-World War Europeans was a lost continent. So I don't think they had absolutely any idea whatsoever.
What languages did they speak when you were in Paris? I mean, the total sum. They spoke Yiddish, and your father
Polish.
spoke in Polish, and your father spoke Russian.
Right. But there were a lot of Polish refugees in Paris, and I don't think there was any problem.
Did the rest of your family speak Russian as well, or?
My mother, because the area Sasov had been under so many different. My mother spoke Polish, German, and Ukrainian, and so did my grandmother, and Yiddish, of course. My father spoke Russian, also in addition, because he had been in the Russian army.
In German as well?
I don't think he spoke German. My mother had gone to secular schools, and they learned German there. I think my father had also gone. My mother had a knack for languages, so she spoke all the languages well. I think my father also spoke German, but not nearly as well.
And what about you?
Oh, dear me. At that point, I was speaking Polish and Yiddish.
So here you were beginning to get the idea you were going to a Spanish-speaking country. How did that develop?
Quite frankly, I don't even think my parents knew what language was spoken in the Dominican Republic. I don't really think they had absolutely any idea of what the country was like, what was spoken, what they were going to encounter. I think they were just, since that was the place that would take them, they were prepared to go there.
What embassies had your father visited? Where had he tried to immigrate?
I don't know. I know he said several. Certainly the United States embassy. Several others, perhaps the Argentinian. I think he was familiar with Argentina and Uruguay, because in fact there had been some people from Sasov who had emigrated in the 1920s to Uruguay, and so I assume he went to those embassies, but specifically I don't know which ones.
Had your grandmother had a suitor at some point around this time?
My grandmother had a suitor in Gliwice, in Lakritz, and but because he criticized my actions, I was apparently a somewhat rebellious child, a bit unruly, and he didn't like that, and he criticized me. He called me a lotz, which is sort of a wild being. That was the end of that suitor.
So they're very protective of you.
Yes. My mother especially was incredibly protective, and I think that's one reason she never spoke about her experiences. And
to protect you?
I think so. She would occasionally allude to them, and then she wouldn't say any more, or she'd say something, "Oh, you don't want to know." And at that point, at that stage of my life, I didn't want to know. Of course, now I'm sorry that I didn't want to know and that I didn't find out more. She died in 1985, and she was sick for a year. She had pancreatic cancer. And during that time, I really didn't feel that I wanted to talk to her about her wartime experiences, although maybe she would have talked about it. Maybe it would have been a relief to her. I don't know.
You said she alluded to some things. What sorts of things do you remember her alluding to?
Well, in the when she was in the working camp, I think that perhaps the fact that one or several Ukrainian guards would let her sneak out, I think that she may have had to pay with sexual favors, or so she was very, very reluctant to talk about that period. But as I said, I really don't know. This is my interpretation of it now, but I have no idea if it's true or not. But it certainly wouldn't be surprising.
So after the war was over, she still was trying to protect you and wouldn't.
Very much so. Very much so.
So you left for the Dominican Republic. Do you remember leaving
Yes.
France?
We took we sailed from Marseille to Martinique, which was our first experience in a tropical island. And I remember that as being a very, very strange and exciting time. Martinique was very exotic to us, and certainly was very exotic to me. I remember I was fascinated by these women who carried these huge loads on their heads, and I remember following one, and she thought I was in some way giving her the evil eye or being disrespectful, or whatever, and she turned around, and I'm sure she would have torn me apart had my mother not snatched me away. And from the Dominican Republic, from Martinique, we went to the Dominican Republic.
Did you go? Were you traveling with other people that you knew in France? You were all by yourself.
No, we were by ourselves.
No, there weren't other refugees on the ship.
No. You see, my parents refused to stay in a DP camp. Most of the other refugees who were waiting for their visa number to come up were in displaced persons camp, and my parents refused to do that.
Do you know why?
I just think they had enough of wartime conditions and being herded about, and I just think I think the fact that my father really had not, that my father had survived the war as an officer in the Russian army, where he was really in command and in charge. He just wasn't prepared to be in a subservient role.
And they also in some way had the means to do this. Was this through your cousin in Paris?
No. Well, when they had
the means not to stay in a DP camp.
No, because I think they must have had some help from the refugee organizations. Yeah, like when I say that we went from Poland to Paris in a train, this was not exactly first class travel. Our possessions consisted of a big feather comforter, which my grandmother plopped into the toilet in the bathroom, and that's where I sat, and my father traveled between the cars. So it was not luxury travel.
He traveled between the cars.
Yes, on the you know, the
The
couplings,
platform,
the
yeah,
platform,
yeah,
you know,
okay.
because the trains were so crowded, and so there was just such massive movement of humanity at that time from place to place. People were trying to go places.
So you do remember that trip?
Yes, yes.
What about the ship? Do you remember taking the ship?
Yes, I remember that I was not terribly seasick, whereas my grandmother and my mother were. And this was a converted troop ship, so that there were bunks. It was a big room with bunks. And I know that my grandmother and my mother were quite sick, seasick. And I wasn't terribly seasick.
So it wasn't luxury accommodations that
No,
on
it
the
was
troop
not.
ship?
No.
And as far as you knew, there weren't other refugees with you on the ship?
Well, I'm sure there were, but not refugees that were going to the Dominican Republic. When we came to the Dominican Republic, we were the first post-World War Jewish refugees to arrive there.
And your family came by yourselves, and
Yes, we were met by a representative of the Jewish agency, or in at that time what was Ciudad Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, which is now Santo Domingo. And we had to, I remember that we had to, in order to enter the Dominican Republic, each person had to have a certain amount of money. It was a minimal amount of money, but we didn't have it. And so we had to stay overnight on the ship until the representative of the Jewish agency, which came and vouched for us, and we got off the ship. And then we went from Ciudad Trujillo, we went to Sosua, which was a colony in the northern part of the Dominican Republic, as you saw on the tape. And we lived there for 5 years. The government granted the land to the refugees, and we had a farm. My father practiced dentistry once the other dentist, Dr. Rubicek, left for the United States. And he also taught in the school there, Escuela Cristóbal Colón.
What did he teach?
I think he taught Hebrew. He was in charge. It was the school, Escuela Cristóbal Colón, was founded by the refugees, but it also had it had Dominican students also. But because the majority of the students were Jewish, the Sosua had been founded by mostly German and Austrian Jews, and all the students would participate in the Hanukkah plays and the Purim spiels, and it was quite an interesting mixture.
Now, the Sosua was founded in 1940.
Yes.
Will you tell some about the founding of Sosua, a little bit about it?
Yes. The Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, wanted to attract immigrants, basically to quote, whiten his country. He was quite a racist. Even though one of his grandparents was Haitian, but he, in the worst way, wanted to be white. And so on land that belonged to him, I think 2/3 of the Dominican Republic belonged to him, he granted this land to refugees, and the German and mostly German and Austrian refugees who had fled Europe, some of them by way of Shanghai. They established a colony, a very flourishing colony, which became the established a premier dairy industry in the Dominican Republic. And by the time we came in 1946, it was really quite established. It had institutions. It had a school which had been founded, Escuela Cristobal Colon. It had a synagogue was built, and it was a thriving community.
Of how many people?
At the height, probably 2,000 refugees.
Mostly from Germany and Austria?
Yes.
Any from Poland? Did you know any?
Yes, there were a couple of Jewish families, a couple of Polish families. In fact, two Polish families, the Polacks and the last name, Helena and Fritz. She was Polish, he was German. And even in Sosua there was a tension between the Polish Jews and the German Jews.
You remember that?
Oh yes, the German Jews considered themselves superior. We used to call them the Yekis.
Now, you arrived about 6 years after the founding
Yes.
of the town, and you said you were the first post-war refugees. Do you remember what kind of welcome you received, or what that was like when you arrived?
I think a very warm welcome. It was,
Did they do anything specially to announce your arrival, or?
I don't remember. No, I don't think so. I think they were busy with their own affairs.
Were there other refugees who came after you?
Yes, there were. There were actually. There was a family, a Strauss family, that came after us. There were several families that came afterwards, but none of them came from Europe. They came from Shanghai. And then, interestingly enough, later on in the 50-51, there were several Israeli families who came and settled in Sosua.
And the people from Shanghai had left Europe and then stayed some number of years in
Yeah, they
Shanghai?
had been interned in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you first arrived in Sosua, what was your reaction? What do you remember?
Oh, I remember developing boils. Must have been something to do with change in climate, but I had absolutely terrible boils on some very uncomfortable parts of my body, or that were very uncomfortable.
What did they do to treat the boils?
This was in Ciudad Trujillo, and there was a Jewish doctor there, a refugee also, who treated them. I don't remember how, but I obviously got rid of them.
You had not been with other children most of your life.
Right.
What was that like for you to finally settle into a community where there were other children around?
I remember being very feisty. Getting into a lot of fights and arguments, and not compromising a lot. I don't think I knew how to compromise terribly much. So I remember getting into terrible fights with some of the boys, especially.
You were in a community, though, primarily of Jews.
Yes.
And do you remember how that felt?
Yes. Well, at that time, it was a very Jewish life sort of flourished, even though most of the refugees were quite secular. We had in the schools. In fact, I should have brought a magazine, Holiday magazine, which no longer exists, did a feature on the refugees of the Dominican Republic, and my father is pictured there giving a speech. We had a lot of school productions, lots of plays, lots of recitations, lots of parties. It was really a very, very happy and joyful time.
Now, most of the residents of Sosua had lived through pre-war Europe, but not the war.
Right.
And,
right. Yes. So they were not. That's why it was interesting. The Germans were still very German. The Austrians were still very Austrian, and in fact, Mrs. Keeble, one that you saw, her son, she sent her son to school in Austria for high school, and many of them went back to Germany. Some of them went back permanently, not too many, but many of them sent their children to school. So they had not lived through the war, through the Holocaust in Germany or in Europe, and so they had a very different. They were very German, and in fact, I learned to speak German in the Dominican Republic because that was the language besides Spanish. And the Dominican kids that went to Escuela Cristóbal Colón just took part and participated in all the Jewish activities and all the Jewish festivities. Of course, we celebrated all the other. We didn't celebrate religious holidays. We celebrated national holidays.
And relations were good between the Dominicans and the Jews.
Yes, excellent. They had no previous contact with Jews whatsoever, and while the Dominicans are nominally Catholic, organized religion does not play or did not play a big part in their lives.
Did people ask you your story when you moved to the Dominican Republic, to Sosua?
They didn't ask me personally. Not that I remember.
So you don't remember talking about
No.
your wartime experiences?
In fact, I really did not talk about my wartime experiences until a few years ago. Like 4 years ago, I think it was, when Rod Bina, who was a high school teacher at Lafollette, and who teaches European history, asked me if I would consider talking. And I really debated, and then decided that it was time to do it. But until then, I had I think I tried to erase it from my mind to really not think about it, not talk about it.
What was that like for you the first time you talked about it in public?
Emotional, but I think it was okay once I did it. Excuse me, I think I did it before. No, I did do it before. In fact, I talked to a 4th or 5th grade class here at Beth Israel. And I put it, I just emphasized the parts that I thought would be appropriate for them. And then after that, Rod asked me if I would do it for his high school class, and I did. And since then, I've done it several times. I've talked to one of my colleagues has 2 daughters, one going to Edgewood and one going to Blessed Sacrament, and they asked me if I would talk about it to their classes, and I did, and something interesting happened in that when I talked to the class at Edgewood, and I was writing and it happened to be right before winter break or Christmas break, and I was writing the names of the people, and all of a sudden I realized that the Żurawska's name, her name was Mary, and his name was Josef Żurawska. So for a Catholic high school, that was very, very significant. And the fact that they had taken us in, it was all very, very symbolic.
Did you maintain contact with Mrs. Żurawska over the years?
Yes, yes. After the war, we had given her the name and address of my grandmother's brother in New York. My grandmother had a brother who had immigrated to the United States long before the war. And she, after the war, she wrote to him, and we were able to maintain contact. And I still write to her. As I said, she died. She was living with one of her daughters, and she just died in March this year. She was 92.
Now, and you write to her in what language?
Well, I shouldn't say I write. My mother used to write in Polish. I basically, we send some money in packages and so on. I just write a few words on cards, and she will write back short letters. So it's a very minimal communication. And if I need to write, now that when her mother died, someone who knows Polish wrote a letter for me. My father's Polish is not so good anymore. He's very reluctant to write. He translates the letters that she writes, and interestingly enough, as I read the letters, I can sort of make out the gist of what they say.
Tell about, you spent, 5 years in Sosua?
Mm-hmm.
Are those very happy memories?
Yes.
Were those good times?
Yes, those were good times. We were safe. We were we were comfortable, and we liked the Dominican people very, very much. And I don't think we would have left had my parents were concerned about the continuity of Jewish life in the Dominican Republic. And most of the people who stayed in the Dominican Republic, their children did intermarry, or they themselves intermarried. And so there's not much left of Jewish life in the Dominican Republic.
How was the concern about the continuity expressed to you, or is that something that you discussed at home, or did you pick up, or?
Yeah, I think that's the reason that we came to the United States, is that, at that point I was 13, so I was aware of.
And you had some younger siblings.
My brother was born in the Dominican Republic. He was born in 1950. So he was a year old when we left.
Is Dominican Republic where you got to really know who your father was?
No, because you mean did I get to know him well? Well, I think he had spent, by the time we left Poland, he had been home for a year, so I think I knew pretty well who he was by then.
So did they talk to you about their plans? Did they of leaving, and how did that?
Yes.
How did the family talk about that?
Well, I think they were very torn about leaving the Dominican Republic, because life was really quite good in the Dominican Republic. And here again, they were 40 years old, and going to another strange country. So they were very torn, and really the only reason I think they did it is because of my brother and me. Could see no continuity of Jewish life.
Had they learned Spanish?
Oh yes,
They had.
Yes.
And how about English?
No.
Nobody spoke English.
Nobody spoke English.
You were refugees for a long time.
Well, we didn't consider ourselves refugees in the Dominican Republic.
No, but again.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
to come to the United States. That was probably, in some ways, even more traumatic for my parents than going to the Dominican Republic, because after the war, there were so many refugees, and it was expected, and conditions in Poland were so intolerable for Jews, at least psychologically, that they were glad to get out of there. And so coming to the Dominican Republic in some ways was less traumatic than coming to the United States. They were older, they had 2 children. My father was not able to practice dentistry. They had certain expectations from the family that was here in the United States. And so it was very, very tough for them. Very tough. And for me.
You mentioned the expectations. What was that?
Well, my father had a sister in Milwaukee. And I think they just expected a very warm welcome. And there was some other family in Milwaukee. He had an uncle in Milwaukee. And for instance, the first Pesach, nobody invited us for a Seder. So it was very traumatic, very traumatic.
Tell about your experiences. You said it was hard for you too. What do you remember?
Oh, that I remember very well. I started school, Steuben Junior High School, 8th grade, without knowing a word of English. Luckily, we had a wonderful neighbor in the Dominican Republic who took me under her wing and went with me and enrolled me in Steuben Junior High School and so on. But once I was there, and at that time they didn't have any English as a second language classes, so it was sink or swim, and I would come home every single night, throw a tantrum and throw books on the floor and cry because I couldn't understand what was going on. And of course, my poor mother, who bore the brunt of it, was very, very upset.
How long did it take before you caught on?
About 6 months. Yeah.
That was a very hard 6 months.
Very. Luckily, it was very interesting because I still remember some of the teachers that I had at Steuben High School, Steuben Junior High School, who were absolutely wonderful. At that time, non-English speakers were a rarity, so everybody made a big fuss over me. And the teachers, I still remember who they are, were wonderful and helped. And I remember one who was a character history teacher, Mr. Clark, who would always give tests or exams, and then he was a sports nut. He would always throw in some question about sports. And of course, I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. But the other thing that I found that made it easier is that I was used to studying material and then, let's say, taking exams after a year and having to know all the material from the previous year or from the previous few years, whereas here I could just learn the little bit and reproduce it on a test, and I would be okay. And so even if I didn't understand what I was reproducing on the test, I did very well. So.
How were you accepted by the other children your age?
I think fairly well, fairly well. As I said, I was sort of a novelty because nobody else, there weren't any other non-English speakers at that time.
And other people didn't know Spanish?
No,
There
no,
was
no, no. So I was quite well accepted.
Did your parents join a congregation at that point?
No, no. First of all, they didn't have any money. I don't think they were used to American institutions, whether they were Jewish institutions or secular institutions. They just, my mother went to work in a grocery store, just putting out vegetables and things like that. And my father went to work in a factory, Alice Chalmers. And no, they never joined.
Was that hard for him after working as a dentist?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's very hard.
So there wasn't any group, a synagogue group or family to welcome you?
No, no.
Did you ever think about, your family think about returning to Sosua?
Oh, I think they would have done it in a minute if they could have. Oh yes, they were terribly unhappy here for a very long time.
For a long time?
Yes.
How long?
Long time. After my father worked in a factory, then my uncle, who owned a grocery store and who thought that's the route that all refugees should take, persuaded them to buy or rent or whatever a grocery store on 40th and Silver Spring in Milwaukee. And my father had absolutely no idea what that involved. My mother, on the other hand, did. She had worked in a grocery store, and she, as I said, in Poland, they had been traders and farmers. She was sort of a woman of many talents. So that the grocery store in the beginning went fairly well because it was a neighborhood grocery store, but of course once these larger grocery stores started coming into the neighborhood, it went downhill and it was just terribly hard economically. So they were unhappy for a very long time. I think I'm not even sure they were ever happy in the United States, to tell you the truth.
How did they address the continuity of Jewish life issues? That's why they left.
Yeah, it's interesting. They never joined a congregation. My father taught me at home, which was not terribly successful because I didn't want to learn. But at least there was, I think they felt that there were other Jews around and that there were opportunities, and indeed, I married a Jewish man, and so I think that was, and my father then taught at, I shouldn't say they never joined a congregation. Later on, when they gave up the grocery store and they moved in Milwaukee, they moved to 58th and Keith, they joined an Orthodox congregation, Anshe Savard, Rabbi Shapiro, and that's when I were married.
Did you, as a child now in this country, in Milwaukee, did you experience any anti-Semitism?
Well, when I first started Stuyvesant Junior High School, there were a couple of girls who befriended me originally when I started, and they asked me what church I belonged to, and when I said I was Jewish, that was the end of the friendship. And then most of the friends that I made were Jewish. But I don't think I ever, after Steuben Junior High School, I went to Washington High School, which was about 30 to 35% Jewish. I didn't have terribly many friends. I had one very close non-Jewish friend, Carol Zemsky, and maybe 2 or 3 Jewish girlfriends. But again, I was so, looking back, I really had no idea about organizations or belonging to this group or that group. I know Carol tried to get me to join Rainbow Girls.
Campfire group?
No. It was she was very active in that. And I went to one meeting and I had no idea what was going on, and that was it. I really had no idea about teenage life at all. I'm clueless, really clueless.
Do you regret your move to Milwaukee?
Oh, no. I think I don't, certainly. My parents did. But no, it was.
Do you think your father does still?
Oh, I'm sure. Oh, I'm sure.
That he does?
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Did he go back to the Saussure reunion with you?
No, he doesn't. He does not. He doesn't want to travel. He doesn't want to go anyplace. He just likes to stay put.
Is he in touch with people from Saussure?
No. Well, I shouldn't say no. Actually, yes. Desi Scher, who was a very close friend of his and who's my brother's godfather, emigrated to Canada, and he's in touch with him occasionally. They talk on the telephone. Yeah, and then when my mother was alive, she corresponded with another family who emigrated to New York, the Polacks. And the woman has since died, so it's people are dying off. The people my parents' age are dying off.
Was it hard for your parents to learn English at that point?
Yes, as I said, my mother had a flair for languages, and she spoke English quite well. And my father understands and reads very well, but his English was never very good. And as he gets older, he's now 86, he's losing a lot more.
Do you ever see, Julie, do you ever see signs that here in Madison, Milwaukee, but you left Milwaukee when you were how old?
After I got married, I was 22. Yeah.
Do you ever see signs of things that worry you today? You were too young to know those signs in Europe before the war, so you only experienced then the devastation of the war, but not the early warning signs. Is there anything that you see now that worries you?
Well, what really worries me is the gap between the rich and the poor, which is something that is very prevalent in the Dominican Republic. And I think that worries me more than signs of, well, I shouldn't say more. I see isolated signs of anti-Semitism, but then there's anti-Semitism and anti-this and anti-that. And I think perhaps there's so much diversity in the United States that hopefully the thing that happened in Europe won't ever come about. But what really worries me is the disparity between the rich and the poor, because I think We saw this in the Dominican Republic, and it's such a horrible state, and I can very clearly see signs of that in the United States now, and it's very disturbing.
In Sosua now, are there Dominicans who are very poor living in Sosua?
Oh, yes. Yes. What's interesting is that Sosua has become quite a tourist resort. And ironically, tremendous amount of Germans, ethnic Germans, coming. And there were, so there's a tremendous tourist boom, but the Dominicans, other than those, few working in the tourist industry and so on, they're not benefiting from it, and it's a real sad situation. In fact, when we went back, and the first time I went back was in 1989, it was so frightening to see how little conditions had changed. It was like there had been no intervening 40 years or 50 years almost. It was frightening. The illiteracy rate things were worse, actually. There was famine, more, I think from reading the newspapers, we didn't so much see it in person, but that there was famine, there was, the illiteracy rate is horrendous. There's a small percentage of rich, and the rest of the people are poor.
What did happen with the continuity of Jewish life there? In the video on Sosua, that was certainly something at the end of that video that a number of people commented about.
Yeah. Well, the people who stayed there, most of them married Dominican people, and you quite often see people wearing a chain with a Magen David and the Virgen de Altagracia, who's the patron saint of the Dominican Republic. They have no idea about Judaism, but they're very proud of being Judíos, or being Jews. But there are no Jewish institutions as such. Well, interesting, the synagogue has been rebuilt. They've built a small museum to house some of the documents. They do have there are services on Friday night, and it's mostly tourists who come to the synagogue. They do have a resident Israeli who serves as the religious leader of the congregation, but he's married to a Dominican woman. So it's a very interesting mix. It's a very interesting, and there was some talk when we were there about starting some kind of program for the children to teach them about their Jewish heritage, but as far as I know, nothing's been done.
Have you told your children, you have 3 children, do they know your story?
Bits and snatches only. I have never sat down and told them the whole story.
Have they been reluctant to ask as much as you have to talk?
I think I've been more reluctant to talk than they have been to ask. I find it much easier talking to strangers than to my children.
Would you want to share this tape with them?
Um, yes, perhaps. Probably, yes.
Do you think they're ready to hear too?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Was your reluctance to talk about your experiences, do you think, or how much of it was protecting them, how much of it was protecting you, or other things? Or I haven't really thought about it in those terms.
Probably me. As I said, I've not been comfortable talking about it until very recently, and only to strangers. And I'm also uncomfortable hearing about it from when my father talks about it. So it's both. I'm reluctant to talk. I think they'd like to hear about it.
When your father talks about it, your reluctance is because it brings back more rich memories, or what?
I just become very, very uncomfortable when he starts talking about it. It's like, enough. I don't want to hear about it. I've been through it. I know about it. I don't need to hear about it. You don't have to tell me about it.
So how has this, not quite 2 hours, been for you?
As I said, talking to strangers is really much less of a problem than talking to my family. So I'm fine, and other than a few uncomfortable moments, really, it's not a problem.
Julie, do you think we've learned anything from your experiences from the Holocaust? What has this world learned in the last 50 years?
And the evidence of what's going on in the world, not a heck of a lot. I really find it quite incredible to see what's going on in Europe and the Balkans. I'm just finding it mind-boggling that after what they went through in World War II, it's as if nobody has learned anything. It's incredible. And the only this time it's not the Jews who are being exterminated. It's mind-boggling, really and truly mind-boggling. In some ways, and this is strange, in some ways, I almost find some comfort in the fact that this time it's not Jews. So it's not only the Jews who were the victims. They're capable of doing this to other people too, maybe not on such an organized scale, and so on. So it's incredible. It's incredible. So I don't think anybody has learned very much at all, unfortunately.
When you spoke to school children, which was the group that you first spoke to, you said, when you told your story?
I think it was the Beth Israel sixth graders.
Mm-hmm. So here, and then in middle school, and
High school.
And high school. And now, what did you and what do you want to tell children about your experience?
Well, I think what I emphasized, first of all, is that people can be incredibly cruel to other people whom they don't consider the same as they are. And then the other side of the coin, I emphasized Mrs. Żurawska's actions, that people can be incredibly good and decent, so that they don't, so that they realize that, that in all this is incredible vileness and inhumanity, there were people who were decent and there were people who were good. So this is what I tried to emphasize to them. And I think it was really interesting, the incredibly perceptive questions that the children asked. And I think especially in the at Blessed Sacrament, this was in 4th grade, but they had been very well prepared. Some of the questions were really very, very perceptive, much more so than in high school at times. I think in high school they were a little more blasé. Put me on the spot. Well, they asked me how did you feel, or do you hate the Germans? Why did Mrs. Żurawska do this? Was she afraid? I mean, they asked on their level, but very, very perceptive questions. And then the fact that something that really hadn't occurred to me when the kids asked, well, do you think the German soldiers knew that you were Jewish? It never really had occurred to me, to tell you the truth. I just assumed that they figured we weren't, but who knows? And the fact that my grandmother was let go. So even among the Germans, there were some.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.